In this video, I'm going to walk you through our guide on how to modify your training around pain or injuries, which if you are a lifter dealing with a pain or injury is probably the most important factor in actually being able to solve that pain, solve the injury, and get back to lifting that you want to be doing. And this guide is basically a summary of the framework that we use when working with our own clients, helping them develop a program that's modifying their training appropriately around their injury is one of the biggest things that we do with them and has the biggest impact on their recovery. So this is definitely an important topic to discuss. This is just a little bit about me, which probably isn't all that important. But this is important for a couple of reasons. When lifters are dealing with an injury, there's often one of two ways that they go about it. Either they completely rest and just avoid the movements that do hurt, or completely avoid training altogether. And this happens for a couple reasons. One, just kind of makes logical sense. If you don't do the things that hurt, then you're probably not going to have pain. So it makes a little bit of sense. The other reason why a lot of lifters do this is because this is what they're told to do by physical therapists, doctors, chiropractors, trusted healthcare providers that they go to when they are dealing with a pain or injury. And rest is not something that we usually recommend for the vast majority of our clients. And this is because essentially complete rest from either training in general or the lifts that hurt is kind of like a Band-Aid solution, or Band-Aid strategy, not really a solution. It's a way for you to feel better in the short term because you're not doing things that aggravate your injury, but in the vast majority of cases, it actually doesn't get you back to train the way that you want to or actually solve the injury because they're not addressing what's actually going on. So many lifters are either told to just completely rest, or that's what they decide to do by themselves. They feel better for a little while and they think that they're ready to get back into training. And after taking some time off, they try to get back to lifting. They start training again like they normally would. And in most cases, the pain or injury just comes right back, oftentimes just as bad or worse than before, or another new injury can pop up. And this is because as you have been avoiding training or avoiding the lifts that hurt, you are becoming detrained to some degree. And the amount of training stress and the amount of just training in general that you can tolerate decreases during this time. So even though you're feeling better because you're not doing the things that aggravate your injury, you are becoming detrained, which makes it easier to get hurt again when you try to get back to lifting. And if you don't modify your training appropriately and avoid this, then you risk becoming detrained and having that vicious cycle start. So a lot of lifters will get injured or deal with some pain, take some time off, feel better, try to get back in training, get hurt again, rest for a while, try to get back to training, and it just kind of goes around and around in circles. The other thing that a lot of lifters do is just ignore their injury altogether and just try to keep on training the way that they were leading up to their injury. And this often doesn't work that well, because if you just continue to do things that are aggravating your injury, it's going to continue to be aggravated. And the longer that happens, or the longer that goes on, then often the harder it is to overcome that and actually solve the injury and get back to productive training and move towards your goals. So because of that, modifying training appropriately is arguably the biggest factor in solving injury. You want to modify your training so you can train comfortably with minimal to no symptoms to let your injury calm down, but also make sure that you don't become detrained, maintain your strength, hypertrophy, endurance, whatever qualities you train for, and ideally even make some progress as you're going through your injury. So this guide is going to show you how to actually modify your training so you can avoid either of those two issues of complete rest or just ignoring your injury and just training like you normally would. So again, modifying your training around your injury is arguably the most impactful thing that you can do to overcome your injury. And there are 5 kind of main variables that you can modify to reduce your pain with training and still be able to do the training that you enjoy and love doing. Those are training volume, training intensity, range of motion, tempo, and the exercise variation. And there's some overlap between exercise variation and things like range of motion and tempo and all that sort of stuff. But we like to think of training modification in those kind of 5 buckets because those give you a really wide range of options or choices to choose from when you are trying to modify training so you can still be productive in the gym and do what you like doing. So we're gonna break those down a little bit further. But before we do that, really the whole goal of training modification is to find what we like to call your entry point into training. And that's the way that you can train that movement or movement pattern, whether it's squatting, hinging, pulling, pressing, clean snatches, whatever the case is, with minimal to no symptoms, so you can let your injury calm down while still training and making progress. And the goal of training modification, especially in the beginning, isn't necessarily to completely remove all pain with any form of lifting that you do while you're doing your training. If you fully pull back and modify that aggressively, where there's no pain or no symptoms whatsoever, then you may run the risk of just modifying too heavily and making your training a little bit too easy, so it's harder to maintain the results that you've had, or harder to continue to make a little bit of progress as you're dealing with this injury. So really the goal is to find ways that you can train through these modifications where you can train with anywhere from 0 to 3, 0 to 4 out of 10 pain. That's kind of our range where we know that you're doing productive training, you can still train fairly hard, make progress, or at least maintain your gains, and not really aggravate your injury. If it starts going above that 3 or 4 out of 10 range, then we might want to further modify a little bit, because it might start getting a little bit too aggravating as far as training stress. But that's the overall goal. Find ways to implement these modifications so that you can train with 3 to 4 or less out of 10 pain, and then slowly progress these modifications over time until you're just back to your regular training, and that'll give you 80-85% plus of the results that you could hope for from the rehab process. So we're gonna kind of dive into each of those variables in a little bit more detail, explain kind of what they are and how you can smartly modify them around your injury and then progress them back to 100% hopefully. So the first variable is training volume, and training volume is basically the total amount of work that you're doing, and this is usually measured in the number of sets that you do for a given lift or in a given training session, or some people measure training volume load, so your sets times reps times the weight, or tonnage or that sort of thing. And for some lifters, they can be a little bit sensitive to volume. So let's say they're dealing with shoulder pain, they may feel pretty good or feel totally fine up until they start benching for more than 4 to 5 hard sets per week. And at that point, maybe it gets a little bit aggravated. So if that's the case and you have a clear kind of volume threshold that above that, your pain starts to become more aggravated, then you know that you can kind of cap your training volume at or just below that threshold, keep it there for a little while to let the injury come down, and then slowly progress over time. And that's kind of how we approach volume sensitive pain or injuries. So we would try to find that threshold, reduce training volume to just below or at that threshold, and then progress from there, but making sure that you're progressing somewhat gradually, adding in 1 set per week, maybe 2 sets per week or per session, and then see how you tolerate it. As you continue to progress that volume, the symptoms may come back a little bit. And if that happens, then usually we recommend either slightly pulling back again or trying to maintain and see if that pain does start to subside, and then letting it even out before you do kind of progress forward again. And then we can also, in that time frame, typically keep training intensity a little bit lower as you're trying to add volume. So if you use RPE, keep it in the 5 to 7 range. If you use reps in reserve, keep it in the 3 to 5 range, and then slowly add in intensity as symptoms stabilize and you can tolerate more regular training volumes. Then from there, the next variable is training intensity, and there's 2 basic types of intensity when it comes to lifting and training. The first is external intensity, which is basically the weight on the bar, the weight that you're moving, or the total resistance that you're moving against as you're going through a lift. So if you're benching 225 pounds is that external intensity. You can also measure external intensity through percent 1 rep max. And then there's internal intensity, which is how hard that set is for you from a training perspective. the two really common ways to measure internal intensity are through RPE, which is rating of perceived exertion, or reps in reserve, or RIR, and those are both basically 0 to 10 scales, and there's a lot of similarities between the two with some subtle differences. But really the goal of training modification, especially when it comes to intensity, is to find ways to reduce that external intensity, especially if your pain or injury is really sensitive to heavier loads or higher efforts. And when kind of discussing all the clients that we've worked with, most people tend to be more sensitive to intensity than they are to volume. So finding ways to pull back on that intensity, whether external or internal, is a really good way to modify around a pain or injury. So you can do that by simply using lighter loads, like going down to 60 or 70% of your 1 rep max. You can train with higher rep ranges, because even if you still train those higher rep ranges to high RPE or low RIR parameters, then the actual weight on the bar or weight that you're moving is going to have to be lighter because it's more reps per set. And then another good kind of like general guideline is the rule of 10. And this is not like a hard and fast rule by any means, but it's a very good framework on like how much you should modify. And basically what the rule of 10 states is that your level of pain and your RPE rating, if you add those two numbers together, it should equal 10. So if you have a pain of 4 out of 10, then you should use a weight for any given set that allows you to lift with an RPE or rating of perceived exertion of 6. If your pain is 2 out of 10, then you can use an RPE 8, because again, those equal 10, and the lower pain you have, the higher the internal intensity that you can train to without really aggravating things. And the way to progress this is couple-fold. One, you can just increase the load on the bar, the load that you're lifting, very gradually every 1 or 2 weeks, and see how symptoms stabilize or improve. And then you can also increase the RPE or lower the reps in reserve closer to that 8 to 10 range for RPE or the 0 to 2 range for RIR as your pain decreases. And then also you can progress rep ranges as you're going through the rehab process with an injury. So initially starting with higher reps per set, because that's going to force you to use lower loads, and then progressing back to lower rep sets of like 3 to 5, 1 to 3, whatever your training is like, as the pain subsides. All right, next is range of motion. And range of motion is essentially the distance and positions that you or the implement that you're lifting with moves through during a given exercise. And this is honestly one of my favorite ways to modify training around injury, because for many people, certain parts of a painful lift will be the most aggravating or the most painful. For instance, if you're dealing with hip or knee pain with squatting, the very bottom of the squat is likely to be the most aggravating part of that movement, just due to the joint demands and like soft tissue and all those other stresses that you experience in that position. For benching, the very bottom of the bench press is usually the worst for shoulder pain. For things like cleans and snatches, if you're dealing with back pain, pulling from the floor or catching in a full squat is usually more aggravating than pulling from higher positions or catching in the power or muscle positions. So you can use that knowledge and that pattern of pain to your advantage and basically temporarily avoid those really aggravating parts of the range of motion for certain lifts. So if you're dealing with near hip pain with squatting, you can use box squats or pin squats as a way to modify that range of motion. So you just set the box or the pin height to a target or to a depth that allows you to squat with relative comfort. You might start like by selecting a box height or a pin height that allows you to squat like above parallel for a little while. And then as your pain improves, then you slowly lower the height of the box or the pins so that you're now squatting like just above parallel, and then at parallel, and then just below parallel, and then finally to full depth. And you can do the same thing with benching for shoulder pain. You can start with floor presses to really limit the range of motion, and then switch to doing spoto presses where you're stopping like 2 inches above the chest and then reversing, and then stopping 1 inch above the chest and then pushing back up, and then finally just going to the chest. And then for things like cleans or snatches, you can do lifts from the hang at different positions. So high hang, mid thigh, above knee, below knee. And then you can also catch in the muscle position without any knee bend, which will really limit loading and the range of motion. Or you can catch in the power position, which will also limit loading and the range of motion, but less so than catching the muscle position. So you can like pretty easily usually identify those really aggravating parts of the range of motion, and then modify that range for those lifts, and then progress those slowly as pain starts to subside. And then next is tempo, which is probably my go-to way to modify most lifts. It's definitely one of my favorite ways, if not my favorite way. And this is because modifying the tempo keeps most other things about the exercise the same, except for the speed that you're moving and the weight that you're lifting. So tempo is essentially the speed of each rep. And there's 2 ways that you can kind of write it or see it. Either a 4-digit format, like a WXYZ, or a 3-digit format, XYZ. I prefer the 3-digit format just because it kind of makes more sense for me. So in the 3-digit format, the XYZ format, X is the length or duration of the eccentric or lowering phase. Y is the length of the pause, typically at the bottom of the movement, except for like deadlifts, cleans, or snatches, where the pause is typically like below or just above the knee. And then Z is the length or the duration of the lifting or eccentric phase. So, for example, a 303 tempo squat would mean that you squat down over a 3-second period, reverse and squat back up over a 3-second period, without any pauses at the bottom or the top of the range of motion. On the other hand, like a 420 tempo would mean that you lower the bar over 4 seconds, pause for 2 seconds at the bottom, and then come back up regular speed. And tempo is a great way to modify a lift around pain or injury, because using longer eccentrics, longer concentrics, pauses, or a combination of the two, or of the three, forces you to use less load for any given rep range. So if normally you could squat 275 for a set of 5 at regular tempo, and then you try to do a set of 5 for squats at a 303 tempo, you may only be able to do like 215, 225, something like that. So you can still train the same rep range, same range of motion, same lift variation, but manipulate the tempo so that you have to use less load on the bar. And for some like soft tissue injuries like tendon or muscle injuries, slowing down is also a great way to mitigate any pain, because they're often worse with like high speed type movements. So for these, also like how you choose to modify the tempo will have bigger ramifications on how much you have to limit loading and how much it impacts pain. So we're naturally like the strongest in the eccentric phase. We're a little bit less strong when we isometrically hold a position, and we're the weakest in the concentric phase. So if you use a tempo modification that uses slow eccentrics and slow concentrics, it's going to limit the load the most, because you're intentionally slowing down the concentric, which is the hardest part of the lift. Whereas if you just do slow eccentrics, that'll still limit the load that you can lift, but not as much as if you also did a slow concentric. And then if you did like slow eccentrics plus a pause, that would limit a little bit more than just the slow eccentrics. So how I typically structure that for my own clients is kind of based upon how much pain they have. For most people, I'll start them with tempos that use slow concentric and eccentrics, like a 303 or 202 tempo. And then once they can train that movement with that tempo and have a lot less or minimal to no pain, then I'll progress to a tempo with a slow eccentric and a pause. So like a 530 or a 420 tempo. And then From there, I might just progress them to either slow eccentric by themselves, so like a 3 to 5 second eccentric, or reps with just a pause at the bottom, like a 2 to 3 second pause. And that's a really nice kind of gradual progression that adds load over time as you can move faster and just have your handle weight as a consequence of that. And obviously, if you're dealing with, or if you're like an Olympic weightlifter or a CrossFit athlete and you do things like cleans, power cleans, snatches, stuff like that, you can use slow pull cleans, slow pull snatches, pauses, variations where you use multiple pauses, like you do like clean or snatch where you do a 2 second pause right after you break from the floor, right below the knee, and then right above the knee, and then finish the lift. Those are all great ways that you can modify tempo and progress over time to get you back to full lifting. And the last variable is basically exercise variation. And this is essentially just like the type of that specific exercise that your performer or you want to train. So if we take squatting, for example, you have back squats, front squats, low bar versus high bar back squats, Zercher squats. For cleans, you have just regular cleans, power cleans, hang power cleans, all these different permutations of the different lifts that you're doing. And changing the variation can help for one of two ways. Either one, the variation that you use is going to force you to use less load than the regular variation. So an example would be a clean versus a power clean. You can't use as much weight during power clean if you can do Olympic weightlifting correctly. And that will force you to use less weight and have less pain, most likely, as you lift. The other reason is certain exercise variations will change how you're stressing certain body parts during that lift. So I've worked with a lot of powerlifters who have like front side shoulder pain when they low bar bench because of the shoulder flexibility demands of that movement. Or sorry, low bar back squat because of the shoulder flexibility demands of that movement. So if we switch them to a high bar squat or something like a safety bar squat or something like that, that can help really dramatically lower the stress on the shoulder and help them be able to still train the squat pretty hard. So just find ways to either limit the loading with that variation or adjust how you're stressing your body. So like I said, for the shoulder pain, if you have shoulder pain with low bar squatting, you can go for like SSB and then high bar squats and then low bar squats. If you have back pain with deadlifting, you can go like sumo or trap bar deadlift first, and then conventional deadlifts. And then if you have knee or hip pain with squatting or snatching, you can start with like hang power variations and then progress to just hang variations and then the full classic lifts from the floor. And those are basically all the variables that you can modify, or most of the variables that you can modify when trying to train around injury. And honestly, when it comes to injury and how to modify things, there's no like black and white, like this is the way you have to do it to get the best results. There's a lot of gray areas. So you can modify one of those variables, you can modify 2, 3, you can modify several of them all at one time based upon how severe your pain is. So if you're having like more severe pain or limitation, then you might want to pick several of those options to modify. For example, in this like patellar tendon kind of case, let's say the lifter is doing 3 sets of 5 at an RP of 7-8, and if your pain isn't too severe, like if it's 2 or 3 out of 10, then you could just switch like a 3-0-3 tempo back squat, regular depth for 3 sets of 5 at an RP of 6 to 7. So really all you're doing is modifying the tempo and the RPE, and that will force you to use less load and therefore probably feel a lot better. However, if the pain is more severe, like 6 or 7 out of 10, then we might want to switch to something like a 3-0-3 tempo box squat above parallel for a couple sets of 10 reps at an RP of 3 to 4. So there you're changing the tempo, you're changing the range of motion, you're changing the rep range and the RPE. So you're modifying intensity, range of motion, speed, all these things to more significantly limit loading and modify that movement to bring that pain down a little bit more. And in both these cases, you just find what style modification or like grouping of modifications that you can use to train that movement with minimal to no pain, find your entry point, train there for a little bit, and then gradually progress over time until you just get back to the regular type of training that you want to be doing. And I'll have this linked as a PDF below this video, so that way if you want to actually download this guide for your own reference, you absolutely can. It contains a little bit more information, a little bit about my story, some more kind of detail about some of these training modifications. And yeah, I hope that this was helpful. Again, if you could do nothing else to try to solve your injury and get back to lifting that you want to be doing, proper training modification is the most important thing. So this guide gives you a really solid foundation on how you can modify, how you can progress those modifications, and ultimately get back to training. And if that's something that you feel like you need one-on-one help with, then you can just click the link below and request a free phone consultation with me or somebody from my team, and we'll see if we can help you out directly.